The reaction of the Western mainstream media, of NATO, stands media, of the collective West, of the United States' mainstream media, was very curious when it comes to the attack that occurred in Moscow on March 22nd. This horrific attack, which has killed over 133 people, likely well more than that, injured hundreds of others in a building that was occupied by thousands. This attack was the biggest terrorist attack in Russia's modern history, and is one that, while immediately garnering condolences from across the so-called adversaries to Russia, from the EU, from NATO, from Washington itself. Meanwhile, you had the stenographers of war in the mainstream media singing a different tune. Now, first, this came in the form of blaming ISIS and saying that this was an ISIS attack, which is very interesting because we haven't heard from ISIS in a major way. I believe there was an attack on Iranian soil recently, that or an Iranian territory that was claimed to be ISIS backed and supported. But ISIS hasn't gotten as much attention as of late, but yet ISIS was the subject of many of the initial reports, and even still, there is an attempt to paint ISIS as those who are responsible, claiming responsibility. And here are just a few of the reports. ABC, ISIS claims responsibility in the attack on Russia's Crocus City Hall. There's one. Then you also had CNN, and so I'm just going to pull this up here. One of the first reports, ISIS claims responsibility for the attack concert venue that left 60. So this was really early on, really early in the morning, claiming ISIS was claiming to be responsible for the attack. They on Telegram, okay, and there's a lovely ad to get you to support this war machine propaganda apparatus. But nonetheless, first it was ISIS. It was ISIS that committed this attack. And then immediately, as the reports came out that at least four of the assailants in this horrific case were apprehended, going to the Bryansk region to cross the border into Ukraine, there were immediate reactions from the Western mainstream media to Putin's assertion of potential Ukrainian involvement. And mind you, Vladimir Putin, in his address to the nation, didn't necessarily say Ukraine was involved. What he said was that the assailants were moving into Ukraine. And many commentators and analysts have intimated and made assertions to the fact that this most likely means Ukraine had knowledge, that there were Ukrainian intelligence with knowledge of this, that it's impossible for these forces who had conducted such a highly organized and well-funded operation could simply be just crossing the Ukrainian border on their own just because. And I also want to bring up the fact, before I get into the Western mainstream media reports, if we are just to take distance out of Russia into the equation, if we were just to take the fact that to drive to the border, let's say to Kharkov, if you wanted to get into Kharkov from Russia, if you wanted to go in that direction across the border out of the Bryansk region of Russia, you would have to travel quite a long way, somewhere between 750 and 800 kilometers. If you wanted to head in a different direction, let's say to Latvia, cross the Latvian border, you're looking at 550 to 650 kilometers. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the direction that they were going really matters, because they were taking the long way out. They were taking an intentional way out. And while you may call this speculation, it also begs the question as to why shouldn't we be hypothesizing about what needs to be investigated the most. If we are looking at the direction that these forces, that these assailants were going in, it really does matter. Why would they be crossing during a time of a state of war, which Russia has said they are in now, in which Ukraine and NATO had been claiming from the beginning of Russia's special military operation? If we are talking about a wartime situation, then we have to ask, well, what did the side of the war, the Ukrainian side, and of course their backers, have to do with this attack? It only makes sense. But here you have the New York Times immediately saying in his first remarks on the attack, Putin tries to link assailants to Ukraine. American officials who have assessed that a branch of the Islamic State was responsible, because, of course, when American officials say it, we should definitely believe it, because they've never lied to us before. They didn't lie to us about weapons of mass destruction. They didn't lie to us about Gaddafi killing his own people, about Assad killing his own people. They didn't lie to us about Assad chemical weapons. They didn't lie to us about a whole number of other propaganda points that they have released to justify their war. So we should believe the American officials who say that ISIS is responsible. But they are concerned that the Russian leader could seek to falsely blame Ukraine. So why are they getting so defensive? He hasn't even blamed Ukraine yet. There's an investigation going on. Yet, as Maria Zakharova said to the media, there is reason to believe that the Ukrainian regime is feeling a bit nervous, that they are in their nervousness and in their desperation revealing their potential involvement while claiming to be opposing this potential accusation. It's quite something. So, he gave a 5-minute address, and he said that someone in Ukraine had tried to help the attackers escape across the border from Russia before they were apprehended by Russian security services. He didn't pin the attack on Ukraine, nor did he refer to the assessment by American officials that a branch of Islamic State was behind it. They were trying to hide and were moving toward Ukraine. Based on preliminary information, a window for crossing the border was prepared for them by the Ukrainian side, which makes a lot of sense, because you would assume that if you are going out of the border, if you're going to cross the border into Ukraine, well, that is not going to be done without government, especially in the conditions of war. Anytime, really, anytime, at least if you are an organized and stable and competent government, anytime there's going to be cross-border activity, especially with potential criminals, you would expect the government to be involved. Well, according to Vladimir Putin and what they know so far, that was happening, but they don't know to what extent. They don't know what involvement was actually had, whether this was some fringe operation or whether it was really a Ukrainian operation with the help of the United States. They don't know yet. But nonetheless, there was a lot of paranoia about that. Here you have also in the Washington Post, Mr. Max Boot, resident neocon, Republican turned anti-Trump, who knows what he is. Putin fixates on imaginary foes while terrorists attack Moscow. So this is what Max Boot had to say. There's a cruel irony in the fact, and this is how cruel the neocons are. When Russians are dying, they begin to talk about irony, right? They're not talking about, oh, well, this is pretty bad. We need to investigate this. We need to be in solidarity with the Russian people. No, they say this is irony for Putin. So that Russia, the perpetrator of so many terrorist attacks, imagine saying this from Syria to Ukraine, was itself struck by terrorists. The Islamic State claimed responsibility, and soon emerged that U.S. intelligence had warned the Russian government that the Islamic State, Khorasan, ISIS affiliate in Afghanistan, was planning to attack Moscow. The U.S. embassy in Moscow even told Americans the capital to avoid concert halls. That was on March 8th. Interesting that he's bringing that up, though. Very interesting. Yet for Vladimir Putin, the dictator, he focused on imaginary threats from Ukrainian Nazis rather than actual Islamist terrorists, blithely dismissing prescient U.S. messages. Providing insight into his twisted psyche, Putin earlier this week described the American notification as a provocative statement that resembled outright blackmail and intention to intimidate and destabilize our society. that Putin ignored U.S. attempts to help only to have his own security forces fail to prevent the attack tells you all you need to know about the natures of his regime. This is what Max Boot is talking about. So here you have, again, this denigration, this immediate, oh, well, whatever Vladimir Putin says about Ukraine and terrorist attacks are off the table. There is not one mention in this article, mind you. It's all about ISIS. It's all about ISIS, but there's not one mention. You can scroll through the whole thing, okay, of the fact, well, there is actually, they've targeted Russian infrastructure, but they're not engaging in terror bombing of Ukraine, of Russian cities. Really? So what happened to Daria Dugina wasn't that? That was Ukraine, definitely. So the attack on the Crimean Bridge, oh, they say just Russian infrastructure, not attack on the city. Well, isn't the Crimean Bridge in Crimea, in a city? You know, this is where things just start to unravel. How about St. Petersburg with Mr. Tatarsky? We can go on and on and on. So this is what they want to do. They want to say it's ISIS. Well, you know, what's interesting about this, okay, and should it be any surprise that Russia is in a state of war right now, according to Dmitry Peskov? It should be of no surprise, because you have people like Mr. Max Boot, and let me just show you exactly who Max Boot is, already drooling for war with Russia, talking straight up war propaganda against Vladimir Putin and the Russian government during this attack, and almost bragging that this attack was successful and that the United States, of all forces, imagine the United States, the actual hegemon, the empire, one that has its tentacles in literally all of the major terrorist attacks all around the world, especially in the global south, especially in West Asia, especially in Afghanistan, especially all over the Levant. Imagine Max Boot saying that Russia should have listened to the United States. I mean, this is the point of Victoria Nuland, now the ousted third of command in the State Department. And of course, Cookies Nuland, you know her from her great work in fomenting and facilitating this proxy war in Ukraine. Victoria Nuland said, this isn't the Russia that we want. And Max Boot made that point quite clear, that they want a compliant Russia. They want one that will speak to them about terrorism, when in fact Russia was fighting US-backed terrorism in Syria, and still is in some ways, but it joined the Syrian government in 2015 to eradicate US-backed terrorism, not just ISIS, but also al-Nusra and many other groups that were literally armed by the United States. Sometimes the CIA and Pentagon armed forces were fighting each other and fighting the Syrian government, and Russia was bombing them to smithereens. So that is real irony. But here you have Max Boot in 2013. In 2002, 2003, he was frothing at the mouth as a resident neocon, drooling for war for the U.S. to invade Iraq. And then in 2013, just 10 years later, he was not repenting about the millions of people who have suffered, the 500,000 children who were killed by U.S. sanctions, over the course of U.S. involvement in Iraq. And of course, the million people who were killed in Iraq by the U.S. occupation and invasion. No remorse. The 10th anniversary at the start of the Iraq War. You can't even read this full article. That's why I pulled this up, because they took it down. The publication that released it originally took it down. And I'm not even going to show you. You can't read the full article. I'll actually show you here. Here you go. On commentary, it's gone. So let me go back and just show you that this is what he had to say just quickly. I would not have backed the invasion if I know what we know now, that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. There were, to be sure, secondary reasons to act. Oh, this is rich. In particular, a desire to implant a democracy in the Middle East. But while I'm a firm believer in democracy promotion, I don't believe that its spread justifies exposing our soldiers to danger unless there's overriding threat to our security. In the case of Iraq, it was almost universally believed prior to the invasion that such a threat existed. Not just the CIA, but Mossad, MI6, and all the other allied intelligence agencies we should all be listening to. Sarcasm should be noted there. And agreed that Saddam's had WMDs. Heck, Even his own generals believed that Saddam outbluffed himself. So again, blaming Saddam Hussein, which is absolutely ridiculous. But no need to repent, he says, because you know what? Mistakes are made. I made a mistake, but nothing, even in that first. If you are talking about a war that killed over 1 million people, displaced many more, destroyed the region, right, had regional consequences, literally caused the formation of ISIS, you would think that there would be some repenting, but no. Actually, now he's bragging about terrorist attacks on Russian soil. So, Max Boot has this just absolutely disgraceful reputation, nonetheless. And then, we need to talk about this blaming ISIS theory because we have to remember that ISIS cannot be viewed in a vacuum, right? ISIS is not just some group that just came out of nowhere and now we need to be scared of them, right? This is how the Western mainstream media has talked about ISIS from the very beginning. But we now know, even the mainstream media, the Western mainstream media, the Guardian of all places, have admitted that ISIS is not just some a fringe, powerfully fringe group that commits attacks on foreign soil against the West. That the truth about it is that the United States fueled its rise. And I'm going to show you in a couple of ways how. First through this article and then through the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, leaked memo that showed the United States and its so-called allies in the region, in order to overthrow the Syrian government, had definite plans to back forces that would eventually become ISIS to overthrow that government, the government of Bashar al-Assad. So here we go. The sectarian group of terror won't be defeated by Western states that incubated it in the first place. The war on terror, that campaign without end, launched 14 years ago by George Bush, is tying itself ever more grotesque contortions. So anyway, let's just skip all that because we need to talk about. Here we go. We need to talk about this. For the past year, so this is in 2015. U.S., British, and other Western forces have been back in Iraq, supposedly for the cause of destroying the hyper-sectarian terror group Islamic State. This was after ISIS overran huge chunks of Iraqi and Syrian territory and proclaimed a self-styled Islamic caliphate. The campaign isn't going well. Last month, so this is in 2015, it's not going well. The Nusra Front is making gains. Was making gains at the time. Luckily, the Syrian government and the Russian government both largely took care of those forces. Now they're all huddled into Idlib and still receiving some support, but not nearly as powerful. So some Iraqis complained that the U.S. sat on its hand while this was all going on. The Americans insisted they were trying to avoid civilian casualties and claimed recent successes. Privately, officials say they don't want to be seen hammering Sunni strongholds in a sectarian war and upsetting their Sunni allies in the Gulf. But how we got here has been revealing now that we know that in 2012, there's a declassified secret U.S. intelligence report which predicts and effectively welcomes the prospect of a Salafist principality in eastern Syria and al-Qaeda-controlled Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. In stark contrast to Western claims at the time, the Defense Intelligence Agency document identifies al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became ISIS, and fellow Salafists as the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria, and states that Western countries, Gulf states, and Turkey were supporting the opposition's effort to take control of eastern Syria. Raising the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality, the Pentagon report goes on. This is exactly what the supporting powers in the opposition want in order to isolate the Syrian regime, which is considered the strategic depth of Shia expansion. Okay, so this is, this is a smoking gun. Now we know, okay? Now we know from a direct source this was happening, all right? So what else do we need to know? It's like, this is what happened 2 years later. This is what happened. There were these forces that emerged. These forces were fighting in Syria. And they say, it doesn't mean that the U.S. created ISIS. But at the same time, okay, we know the U.S. has a long history of this. And I'm just going to pull up the report now. Okay, this is the Defense Intelligence Agency document. So when they claim it's ISIS, whenever the United States claims ISIS did this, ISIS did that. So here it is, Department of Defense information report not finally evaluated by intelligence. So here's a general situation. They talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, Al Qaeda in Iraq, major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. The West, Gulf countries, and Turkey support the opposition, while Russia, China, and Iran support Syria or the regime. So this goes on, exactly as they say, right? It's primary. So the regime's primary importance, but they also talk about Al Qaeda in Iraq, which became ISIS. It talks about Al Qaeda in Iraq considering the Sunnis issue in Iraq to be fatally connected to the Sunni Arabs and Muslims. So it talks about these populations receiving arms from Turkey, okay, and that they want to create a Salafist principality where opposition forces will try to use this territory as a safe haven for its forces, taking advantage of the sympathy of the population. So basically training on the Iraqi-Syria border and then causing a reign of terror. So they knew this. They knew this, and they said Western states, right, Turkey and Gulf states were supporting these forces. And who supports all of those forces, right? So this is what's so interesting, okay? So there's the report. Salafist principality. That is what the United States was supporting. That's what it was strengthening during this dirty war on Syria, and really its overall campaign of war in West Asia, which now they're claiming has something to do, this outgrowth of all of this, ISIS, has something to do with what happened in Russia. So we should all be very, very, very suspicious of this. Okay. Very suspicious of these claims. And then lastly, of course, we have to remember, while she is no longer in power in the State Department, or at least officially, we have Victoria Nuland. How many times had she said in the Western mainstream media before she left office, before she was forced to retire, allegedly, that there were surprises coming for Russia, that there were surprises that they would face in the days and weeks to come? Here is Victoria Nuland talking to the State Department and U.S. government-funded Center for Strategic International Studies.
With this money, Ukraine will be able to fight back in the East, but it will also be able to accelerate the asymmetric warfare that has been most effective on the battlefield. And as I said in Kyiv 3 weeks ago, this supplemental funding will ensure Putin faces some nasty surprises on the battlefield. With this money...
Did you see the way she said nasty surprises? Let's just...
Some nasty surprises, nasty surprises, nasty surprises.
I mean, the way she said, I mean, this is how absolutely unhinged the neocons are. Just the way she said nasty surprises, it was almost like she was getting, similar to Max Boot, like a blood-curdling joy out of this. I don't know if you've ever seen Hereditary. This film, I just recently saw it. Absolutely just creepy. That movie was probably the creepiest movie I've ever watched. And in it, what is so creepy about it is that those who are implicated in some of the most heinous, like satanic ritual, one of the most heinous satanic rituals you can think of, are enjoying it. Maybe not all of them, right? Because there are some people involved who don't even know they're involved. But those who know they're involved are really enjoying it. And it is very, very, very just chilling. And when Victoria Nuland expresses these surprises that Russia would be experiencing at some point in the future, well, my skin kind of crawls a bit, right? So there you have it. You have the United States implicated in the rise of ISIS, and not just implicated in the sense of, because a lot of the major analyses you'll hear about the rise of these like huge armed insurgencies, these terrorist groups, are that, yeah, the United States bombed over there, caused havoc, and that's why people picked up arms. No, that is part of it. Sure, you can lay waste to an area, you can destroy a country and create conditions for it. But those conditions do not create terrorism. People just don't pick up arms and decide to do the bidding of empire, right? A lot of history shows, whether we're talking about Palestine, this has been the case in Palestine before even the before the 1948 Nakba. You had Palestinians taking up arms to fight off the encroaching Zionist occupation. All across the Arab world, you had armed movements to liberate countries and nations and from colonialism. You had an armed wing of the African National Congress in South Africa, which overthrew apartheid. We have a long history of people picking up arms, generally in conditions of depravity and oppression, and usually pointing them toward those who are doing the oppressing. Well, what does Al Qaeda in Iraq? What does ISIS? What does Al Nusra do? They pick up arms and they fight those governments that the United States doesn't like. So we have to question, well, it's more than just being implicated in its rise. It's literally facilitating and creating the very scenarios where such a thing is possible, to the point where we have to believe that if the Central Intelligence Agency and the Pentagon were funding Al Nusra and arming Al Nusra and other various affiliates in Syria, who's to say ISIS did not get their hands on those weapons? Who's to say that there isn't direct involvement with ISIS? Anyway, ISIS just happens to be the brand that is well more scarier and the new iteration of Al Qaeda. And we know Americans and Europeans and others have fought in this group. And we know that whenever there's a U.S. war, Iraq, Syria, Libya, who took over the town of Sirte, the hometown of Muammar Gaddafi? It was ISIS. Because how did they do that? Well, they were fighting in Libya alongside the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, this amalgam of forces that were waging a campaign of terror on behalf of who? NATO. Curious, right? So this is what I'm saying when it comes to this accusation about ISIS doing it. Well, even if it happens to be true, even if we find out that the United States was 100% correct, well, then we got to investigate what is the U.S.'s involvement. I don't care what John Kirby says. I don't care what any U.S. official says. Whenever something like this happens, my first, the light bulb that goes off is the U.S. involved? The United States happens to be the singular force in the world that is so obsessed with war, it's willing to plunge itself into a potential World War III scenario. It's willing to plunge itself and ally with and fund and arm the most egregiously disgusting terrorist forces all over the globe. Why shouldn't we question that? Why shouldn't we question Ukrainian involvement? Why are we being told Ukraine could not possibly be involved? This is just a Putin plot to misdirect and misinform. Well, Ukraine has committed these attacks on Russian soil. This is how they try to browbeat us. This is how these elites try to browbeat us into essentially giving up on the truth and get us to fear telling it. And that is really the conclusion we should take away from all of this. When tragedy strikes like this, when you have so many smoking guns on the side that are saying outright, especially whenever I see the United States, Ukraine, all these forces say, "Oh, no, we had no knowledge." Why do you think they have to say that? Why do you think John Kirby has to say we had no prior knowledge to this? Because much of the world expects the United States to have prior knowledge about attacks like this. So that is why we need actual independent investigations. That's why we need to see and wait and see what Russia comes up with. And we need to see how this affects the course of the conflict, not just in Ukraine, but between the multipolar and the unipolar worlds. Because make no mistake, attacks like this are an attack on the emerging multipolar world. It is an attack on Vladimir Putin's victory in the elections. It is a response to the fact that Russia is winning in Ukraine. It's a response to the fact that all these desperate terrorist attacks in Belgorod and all in other parts of Russia are just not having the effect that was intended. And we can go on and on and on, but the point is that a desperate empire is a dangerous empire, and I am looking straight at the empire when I see things like this happen, and I think you should as well.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.